Welcome back, baseball fans, to the token round of the draft. One of the funnest parts of this project is the finish, putting the finish on the draft and letting teams matriculate to the proper number of players. And the way this works is, if you follow this way back in the fall, when we started the posts, after the World Series, when all the teams decided that they would get their keepers, the waves, and retires, to get to this process, they start with 5 tokens. It's a unit, it's a transaction, and then you use them to balance trades and so forth, moves in the draft. Every team starts with 5 tokens. For 32 teams means 160 tokens. I keep track of every team doing a transaction, gaining or losing tokens from the postseason all the way through the draft to get to a cumulative total over here in this column. Adds up to 160. But most times at 5 it goes up to 7, or maybe it goes down to 2 or 3. So it's somewhere in there. And that is for this process, the token round of the draft. And why we need this process is, I will show you why. We're supposed to, at the end of the draft, have 640 players on 20-man roster through 32 teams. We have 625 players, and there are 15 vacant slots where teams improved a player and left a space on their roster. So those 15 vacant spots have to be filled. Also, teams can choose to simply replace players they don't like anymore with somebody they find in the draft that's available. So it's part of undrafted free agency. It's sort of like in the NFL draft. After the draft wraps up, Mr. Irrelevant is drafted. Everybody gets on the phones and calls all the guys who haven't been drafted yet and say, come to our camp, because as a UDFA, you could beat out a draft choice. Something like that. Okay, so let's take a look at how we get to this order. We start with, Philadelphia's the first pick in the draft, and they have 7 tokens. So what you do is, on the draft sheet, you copy over the draft order and tokens, and then you copy the 32 and subtract 1 token from each, and you keep repeating that process, and then you do a sort, and you sort by number of tokens and draft order number. So you have all the teams here who had 7 tokens, and this is their order in the draft. Philadelphia 1, the Giants 13, Texas 17, Houston, Boston, the Dodgers. Then all the teams with 6, and this is again Philadelphia with 1. It's the first pick. Then with 5, Philadelphia starts there. So those are the order, and some teams, who spent tokens and are below the starting point of 5, won't get choices until much further down the list. So I made records starting in this row. This is the pick number, the first pick in the token round. And I set it up for 192 overall picks, but it'll be much less than that. To give you some idea, I kept last year's token rounds here. And last year, St. Louis had 7. And they all took players: Ron Brand, Ron Stone, Chico Ruiz. And then San Diego, you see 6s and 5s, etc. And teams pass, when they pass, they're passed for good. They don't jump back in. And this usually means that a vacant spot in the roster. And then sometimes players just take a player and swap them out directly. And eventually, once every team passes, then this draft is then over. Everybody's happy with their 20-man roster. And so in the token round last year, let's see, it's 608 minus 531. So 77. So it's really 77 picks. So I just set it up for 192, just in case teams don't pass. And so with that, we'll get into the token round of the draft and see how teams fill those 15 empty roster spots, plus any other players they want to swap out. And that's coming up next. Let's begin the undrafted free agent token round of the draft, starting with the teams who had 7 tokens. And beginning with Philadelphia, who had the first pick in the draft. They needed a corner outfielder in the year of 71, so they took Roy Foster, who was actually with Cleveland, had a dynamite slugger. He had a .439 slugging percentage in 71. Next up, the Giants. We skip all the way down to a team that would be drafting 13th in this. But they had 7 tokens, so they get the next crack at a player. And they took a guy from their own system to be corner outfield, Jim Howarth from 72. A left fielder who's a 3 with a decent on-base percentage. He has a fortunate split. His stats aren't particularly good, with just a 620 OPS, but the split supports him being a one-way player. Then with 7 tokens, you have the Texas Rangers. This is a 2-token move here. They exercise their 7th token, and then they will exercise their 6th token. They had the rights to Dave Nelson, so they decided to improve him to a 1973 card. I really shouldn't say they had the rights to Dave Nelson. Dave Nelson was on the roster with a 71 card. So what they did was they swapped out his 71 for a 73, because now he's a 3E12 second baseman, and he's a AA stealer. It's 286. So that's a lot of improvement. It was worth it for the Rangers to do that. And then the counter move is to move 73 Dave Duncan into his 71 card, where he's actually hits with a little bit more power and a better batting average. A 253 hitter, the 419 slugging. So Duncan and Nelson switch years on the Texas Rangers. That's how you improve 2 players at once. Next up, the Houston Astros. They needed to get a left-handed starting pitcher who could pitch on 3 days rest to help out Larry Dierker, because they had nothing but relief pitchers and nobody who could eat up innings. So they selected Gary Peters. Last decent year. He's got a 4.37 ERA, but closer inspection of the card realizes that he's outstanding against lefties. And he knows that he will put a lot of the lefties that the Dodgers have on the bench, and McCovey and the Giants and so forth. So Gary Peters in a division with a lot of great left-handed hitters for Houston. All right, Boston. They would only make, I think, 1 pick here with token number 7. And they wanted to swap out a catcher. This is the first time a team actually didn't have a hole in the roster. They just wanted to get rid of a guy and replace him with somebody else. So this green shading here means an active player was just booted out of the league. And that player was Jerry Moses, who, by the way, is still looking for work. He was Boston's backup catcher. Now they decided to go with a left-handed hitting backup catcher just to get an extra left-handed bat in the lineup. It's Hal King. Hal King still can work in a platoon with some power for the Red Sox. Next up, the Dodgers with their 7th token. They needed them too, because they had to collect 2 guys from the year of 71. And if you watched the Winter Baseball Classic, you saw this guy make his debut. Jimmy Rosario had a lot of nice stuff on his card as being a 2 rangy center fielder, a B stealer, and a nice on-base percentage. And if there's no transition between Willie Davis to this guy in center field until the next great center fielder comes along, I don't know who that's going to be, because it won't be Rick Monday since he's in Colorado. So I don't know who is a long-term solution in center field for the Dodgers once Willie Davis retires. I think Willie Davis has maybe 2 or 3 years left. Actually, Willie Davis extends his stay. I might make him a lifetime Dodger just to keep him going. All right, that's all the teams that had 7 tokens. So now you get down to the number 6 for 6 tokens. So we're back up top with Philadelphia. They're going to pass. They're happy with their roster. They only had to get a corner outfielder, Roy Foster, to platoon with Johnny Callison. So they did that, and now they're going to pass, which means every time you see Philadelphia, you'll see the word pass next to it as we get to 6 tokens, and then 5, 4, 3, etc. All right, next team is Seattle. Their use of 6 tokens, and this is a 2-parter deal as well. Seattle was not happy with drafting Mike Phillips out of necessity in the draft, and realized that they could do better in that infield if they took 73, different year, 73 Rod Gilbreth. He's only 20, but he's a 318 at third base. But he hits 284, a lot better than Phillips, who at 219. And that's going to help a young expansion team. Those little, they mean a lot to these really bad expansion teams. So the counter move is you got to find a guy for 1974 internally and improve him or push him to there. So that second part of that situation is that Fred Norman had a 73 card, and they moved him into his 74 card. He actually is better. His ERA drops from 360 to 314 in 186 innings. So he doesn't pitch on 3 days rest anymore, but Seattle doesn't need him to do that. So Gilbreth and Norman, 2 parts transaction there. Next up, Baltimore, using their 6th token. And they got Bobby Wine. So this is all pretext for a future trade. They had to get a 2 shortstop. They wanted a 1 shortstop, and Mark Belanger was acquired by Cleveland through Portland in the offseason. Baltimore also drafted Frank Duffy. So the big move is they would trade Frank Duffy to Cleveland for Mark Belanger, and there might be tokens involved, I'm not sure, depending on how the defense goes. It's not a big deal. But Bobby Wine is a 1-year stopgap shortstop until Mark Belanger returns to Baltimore. All right, next up with 6 tokens. This is very impressive. You got an expansion team, the Ohio Players, team drafting 12th overall with a bonus 6th token, and they pass. That means they're happy with how the draft went, and they like the players on their team. They're saying, let's go. I don't want to change anything. So congratulations to Ohio. Team 13 was the Giants, who took Howarth with their 7th token. They're going to now pass. And now we're going to start to see passes. Next up is the Colorado Rockies, cashing in their 6th token. They get a, this is really interesting, they needed a catcher first baseman, and Glenn Borgman is a catcher first baseman. They don't have his first base defense listed here, but he can play first base. 234 hitter, but a nice 325 on base percentage for Glenn Borgman. All right. Next, after Texas did their 2nd transaction with Dave Duncan, we have the Minnesota Twins making the first of a couple moves with their 6th token. So Kurt Blefary was let go by Baltimore up here in the year of 71 when they acquired Bobby Wine. So Blefary became a free agent. And literally 5 transactions later, the Minnesota Twins spoke up and said, we like Kurt Blefary's card in Baltimore. And it is a nice card. It's a left-handed hitter with power. Could even play a few minutes against left-handed pitching with a lot of walks. But it's his versatility that's great. 2nd, 3rd, infield, and 1st in the outfield. They plan to have him platoon a little bit with Soderholm at 3rd for the Twins. Maybe Chico Cardenas at short. All right, next up we have the Twins with their 6th token. The Astros with their 6th token. After going Gary Peters, they're done, they pass. And the Red Sox, after acquiring Hal King, they're also done. So this is a very interesting story where you actually have teams who acquired money. They added currency in this draft, but then they decide not to cash it in because they're happy with the roster. So that's a good franchise that drafts well and gets bonus transactions that they don't even have to use. Put that money in the bank. So we talked about the Dodgers. They needed 2 players. They had Jimmy Rosario with transaction token 7, and with token 6 they needed a corner outfielder against left-handed pitching, and they found Billy Cohen, who really has an opportunistic split, a 276 hitter, but it hits close to 300 against left-handed pitching. So that is a great corner outfield spot. He will platoon with Willie Crawford. All right, the New York Mets. Now this is a 3-token move starting with their 6th token. They would use their 6th, 5th, and 4th tokens to improve 3 players. First move is they get Lee Lacy's 74 card. And the reason is that they particularly like his card over their present second baseman, Ted Martinez. And Ted Martinez is looking for work. He's up here, and he's looking for work. He gets kicked out of New York because they feel like Lee Lacy is an upgrade, a 282 hitter with some nice future coming up, a better utility player. But really, they want him to play second base in year one with his 282 batting average and a bunch of doubles on his card. He doesn't have the homers, but he's got a bunch of doubles, and he's got a 359 slugging. So it's a nice card for Lee Lacy to be the new second baseman. So we'll do all the Mets transactions here at once, as they're all related. So after that, adding him, they now have an extra 74 card. So they move Cy Acosta from his 72 card, a present New York Met, Cy Acosta, into his 73 card, which is pretty much the same. A guy who's good about getting right-handers out, but not lefties. And then the third is in the year of 72. It was the Mets. They drafted John Milner, but then they decided to move him into the 72 card. So you see they got rid of 72 Acosta, 73 Ted Martinez, and 74 Milner, and then they put two of those three players in different years. Milner and Acosta are still on the Mets, and they added Lee Lacy instead of Ted Martinez. It's literally that, like trading with yourself. But you end up with all three players are slightly better for the Mets. 72 Milner brings a lot more power than 74 Milner in a platoon. He's got 17 homers, but only in 362 at-bats. He's got a 423 slugging. And he's not that great against left-handed pitching, but they're not concerned about that because they're actually going to put Willie Mays at first base if they need to against left-handed pitching, or they could have Milner play first, and they have Dave Marshall and Bobby Darwin as two extra options in the outfield if they move Mays over. So three nice. I haven't done a three-player move like that involving 3 years, but it worked out where the Mets improved three guys. So that they clearly do that. It all started by realizing that they didn't want Ted Martinez, that they could improve upon him. And they did, but they had to involve 2 other years to do it. That's the ambition right there. All right. That's the end of the 6 token moves, by the way. We have a 7 and a 6. So now we're doing the 5 token moves. And 5 should be the predominant number, because that's what you start with. You start with 5. So we have Philadelphia and Kansas City. Kansas City passes. They didn't make any moves in this. San Diego passes. They didn't make any moves in this. New York Yankees are on the clock with their 5th token. They needed a catcher first base, and that's what they got. They got a catcher first base, Fred Kendall. And he's also better against lefties than righties, which is nice because they have left-handers Ron Blomberg and Tom Hutton at DH and first base. So you could actually leave Munson catching and put Fred Kendall at first base when he's not the backup catcher for Munson. All right, the Expos, Team 5. They exercised their token, and they needed a shortstop, a backup shortstop, behind Gary Sutherland, who's a 4. So they're looking for a 3 shortstop, and they found one. Mick Kelleher, he's a 3 shortstop, a 159 batting average, but he's got a ton of walks on his card. So his on-base percentage is actually 73 points higher than his batting average, which is pretty good, making the best of a bad situation, and just have him play only against left-handed pitching will help Mick Kelleher out a lot. All right, after Seattle completes the moves of Fred Norman and Rod Gilbreth, Baltimore adds another player, and this is they had to vacate the 72 year earlier when they improved Bobby Grich, so they needed a player from 72. They decided to get a left-handed bat from that season. Didn't find a lot they liked, but they found Tom Chopay, who actually did play for Baltimore as a pinch hitter in 72, probably the last year before the designated hitter, and by the time the DH rolled around full-time, a guy like Chopay wasn't needed anymore. Chopay can play the outfield defense for you if you need it, but he's more likely just an on-base, but again, this guy's on-base percentage is 86 points higher than his batting average, so he actually drew a lot of walks. All right, next up, the Angels, Team 11 in the 5th token round. They needed a catcher against right-handed pitching, and they got Ken Rudolph,
who brings power behind the plate against right-handed pitching. Him and Art Kuznire will platoon catching for the Angels. Not particularly fancy, but they get the job done. You know, Rudolph represented the best catcher versus right-handed pitching in '72 who was still available because of power and an advantageous split. All right, so now we're at Team 12, which we know is Ohio players who passed earlier, and the Giants who passed earlier. Same situations there. So now Detroit, we haven't heard from them yet. And the Tigers, with their 5th token use, needed to get a right-handed pitcher. They had Bill Slayback in the bullpen, but he can also be a starter. So with starting pitching in the year of '72 looking kind of thin, they elected to move Bill Slayback into the number 4 spot in the rotation and select relief pitcher George Culver, who represented the best available relief pitcher sorted by WHIP, putting guys on base. He also had a 3.05 ERA in 97 innings, 45 relief appearances only. So Culver was the best pitcher available in the year of 1972, and Detroit took him. All right, next up we have Colorado Rockies. They took a player earlier, but now they want to pass. Texas Rangers, after completing those 2 moves to get Dave Duncan and Dave Nelson in different years, they've passed. We're hearing from Milwaukee Brewers for the first time. And Milwaukee Brewers are happy with their draft. They've passed. All right, now the Twins. The Twins made a move earlier for Blefary with their 6th token. And so now what they decided to do was to bring back Ron Peranowski, who's 35 years old. They're going to bring him back 1 more year because they didn't like Don Eddy. So Don Eddy was the lefty, one of the lefties in the bullpen. Just walks a ton of guys. But they bring back Peranowski in the hopes that he gets some lefties out, and he gets crushed by right-handed hitters now. So hopefully he's just a lefty specialist in that regard. Next up, Cleveland, Team 25. And the Indians did not make a move, I believe, in the draft. Yes, they would pass. Houston, they've passed. Houston and Boston have passed, and now the Dodgers have passed. Okay, then you see the Mets' second part of that transaction. And then the Cincinnati Reds. So now we get to the 32nd team. And the Reds added a player. They needed a left-handed bat, but not in the outfield, where they already had 3 left-handed bats. They had Rose, Geronimo, and Bobby Tolan. They like to have a left-handed bat in one of the other positions, and the most vulnerable one would have been Tommy Helms as the lowest batting average. So we took Jimmy Stewart to be a left-handed option to play some second base against right-handed pitching if you want to get an extra lefty in the lineup. And he's also a utility player, can play over the place for Cincinnati. That's just kind of a homer pick for the Reds, taking a guy who was already in their system. All right, so now we're down to the 4 tokens, and we're going to start seeing a lot of passes now. This is the team number in that round, the token 4. So you see teams 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 9 have all passed. Team 8 does not have enough tokens, so we're going to have to hear from Team 8 later in this. But Florida, Team 10, needed to add a couple guys, and the first guy they added was a 3rd baseman who's a 2. E rating's kind of high, but that effectively moves Hal McRae to DH. Celerino Sanchez. Celerino Sanchez was a Yankee, good rangy 2, better against lefties and righties. Hit .248. If you lose, is averagely better if you play him mostly against lefties. Next up, the Angels. They acquired Ken Rudolph earlier, but they also had an empty roster spot, and believe it or not, they have had the rights to Eddie Fisher this entire draft, and they waited this long to finally cash in Eddie Fisher's card in '71. A lot of teams talked to California saying, we liked Eddie Fisher, can you give up his rights? And they said, nope. But the draft's over. I don't care. We still got his rights. We're going to take him in the token round, which is what they did. So Eddie Fisher in '71's got a .272 ERA in 119 innings. And they really liked that card. And they waited here. There was some jostling to get him into '71. They had to move Dave LaRoche from '71 to '72. And that's how that created space for Ken Rudolph in that spot. All right, now you'll have teams 12 and 13 passing again. And the Tigers, we mentioned this earlier, that they drafted Grabarkowitz in 72 specifically to replace him with the 71 card. And that's exactly what we have here. The 71 Grabarkowitz, and George Culver takes the 72 year for Grabarkowitz. And 71, the reason they had a vacancy in the year of 71 is that Willie Horton used to be in 71, but they improved him to a 74 card, where he has like 1,000 OPS or something like that. So the years 71, 72, and 74 all got better for 3 different Tiger players: Willie Horton, George Culver, and now Billy Grabarkowitz. So here it is. Grabarkowitz, a 2 at third, which is what they really need. And they also have Verizon and Jerry Terrell at short and third as well if they need it. Grabarkowitz got a 389 on base percentage with a ton of walks on his card, and that's what they wanted. All right, next up, teams that have passed before, including teams 15. We haven't heard from team 16 yet. 17, 18, we haven't heard from 19, 20, or 21 yet. And then you have 22, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then the White Sox. The White Sox, with their first move, they needed to add a pitcher, a starting pitcher or reliever. They elected a starting pitcher in the year of 71, and they went internally to their own system. They found Bart Johnson's 71 card for the Chi Sox. He's 21 years old, but he's 12 and 10 with a 2.93 ERA in 178 innings. So they're going to have him be the number 4 starter. They're going to move Lou Krause into the bullpen. So Bart Johnson will be pitching behind Stan Bonson, Bradley, and Wilbur Wood for the White Sox. Big move there. All right, then you have the third and final transaction for the Mets. And then the Cincinnati Reds have passed. So now we go down to 3 tokens, and now you're going to finally start to see the teams who have not had any money finally get to spend. Well, what that really means is those 3 teams, or however many teams that is, could not have acquired any of these guys until, so they're picking like the 50th guy available. So, again, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 all passing. And then we finally hear from Portland. This is the first time we've heard from them. They need a utility player who can play shortstop against lefties, giving Fred Stanley a spell. And the best I could find in the year of 72 is Hector Torres, who hits 155. And yeah, this is why if you spend your money in the draft, you end up with Hector Torres instead of, a better utility infielder like a Rod Gilbreth or Mick Kelleher or whoever. So that's who Portland took. Baltimore finally elects to pass. Florida had to make another move. They needed a left-handed starter, and this might be one of the best moves in the token draft, folks. In the year of 73, they plucked Rich Folkers away from the Cardinals. Remember, we talked about it during the earlier part of the draft. They lost 2 relievers to the Cardinals in this process, players from their system. They lost Orlando Pena, and they lost Rich Folkers. Oddly enough, both to the Marlins. So the Florida Marlins acquired 2 St. Louis Cardinal pitchers in this draft. And that's sort of how it has to happen, because Florida doesn't exist. So the traditional teams have to, stock up. Don't think of it as a 20-man roster. Think of it as an 80-man roster, because you have the same traditional Major League franchises over a period of 4 years. So you should be able to find additional players and not feel the burn of losing a couple guys every now and then. So Florida takes Rich Folkers. He's also a relief starter 7, which is really nice. All right, now we have the Angels finally passing. We get teams 12 through 15 to pass, and then we finally hear from the Arizona team. Arizona needed either a second baseman or a third baseman against lefties, and they have Steve Braun who could play both positions. And they found Julian Javier, who was a Cardinal. Cardinals moved him to the Dodgers for Sizemore to the Cardinals. Dodgers waived Julian Javier because they're going to had Davey Lopes. So Julian Javier is 34 years old, just sitting out there. He's still a 2 defensive player, and he hits lefties better than righties with a 259 batting average. he becomes an Arizona Diamondback. And now you see the rest of this 3-token round, everybody's got to the pass point. And we're almost done here, folks. We get down to the 2 tokens left, starting with Philadelphia again, and this is where the draft will finally end, as there's only one more team we have not heard from yet. It's the Oakland A's at Team 31. They were down at just $2 of money. They exhausted 3 tokens in this process. They used 2 of their tokens up to acquire Orlando Cepeda from Philadelphia, so that knocked them down from 5 to 3. And they lost another token getting Lynn McLaughlin off of the Red Sox to go from 3 to 2. So with their $2 left, and this is also the pick number with 127th pick after a bunch of passes as well. They took a guy who was on waivers to be a utility infielder, Joe Foy, at age 28. He is your middle utility infielder, and he's got a .363 on-base percentage. And we all know those Oakland A's love to draw walks. Oakland loves to draw walks, and Joe Foy is a perfect fit to back up Sal Bando, Bert Campaneris, and Dick Green. He might actually get a lot of play at second base for Green, the weakest of those 3 hitters. But that concludes the token round of the draft. Once we knew that Oakland was the only team, we could have stopped right there. There's no need to continue with this currency here. So that is it for the token round of the draft, and now it's play ball, because with this, every team's got 640 players. As a matter of fact, we have a spreadsheet here that is alphabetized by team, and we have this row number 640. Everybody, there's 640 players in the league. Also here, for instance, this is Toronto here. This is Texas here. And you see the year and player number in this column here. 7101 and 7102 were drafted, joining 73, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 in the first year. 7201, 7202 were drafted, joining 7203, 4, 5, 6 there. 7301, 7302 were drafted, joining 73 and 74 there. And then lastly, in the year of 74, 2 new guys, 7401 and 7402. And that's how you make sure that you've got the 8 players in year 1, 6 in year 2, 4 in year 3, 2 in year 4. And that's the proper math you need to get your league started. Thanks for checking this out, folks. We'll see you next time.